Ben. So welcome everybody. It's great to see a good gathering here. I'd like to first acknowledge that we're meeting on First Nations lands, and I'm talking to you from the land of the Kaurna people in South Australia, and I pay my respect to their elders past, present and emerging. And I'm very pleased to welcome Jessica Wright, who's generously agreed to present some of her work for us today. Jess is a novelist as well as a scholar, and she's currently a senior lecturer in creative writing and English lit at UniSA, where she's writing an ecobiography of Western Australia's first non-Indigenous female scientist, Georgiana Molloy. But she's also an expert in Australian Cli-Fi and is currently doing some research in that space, and that's what she's speaking to us about. So thank you so much, Jessica, and I'll hand over to you.
Thank you. Thanks, Emily. And thanks everyone for coming. I'm quite deaf. I can only hear a little bit out of my right ear. So when we come to questions, Emily will type them into the chat box for me just to make sure I don't make a mistake, which I sometimes do. So just getting my presentation going. Is it full screen or is it not? Or has it got the
It's taking up the full screen, but it's not in the slideshow format.
I'm not sure what's going on. Okay, so there's my title page, and here's the quote I want to start with. Here we go. So, Muninjali author Ellen van Neerven writes in this fabulous essay. You can find it online in a journal called Wright Now, which is about legal issues. She says we need new ways of speaking about uncertain futures, and the term climate change is often too vague and removed with the here and now of rising seas, changing temperatures and species devastation to sink in. Australians' habitats, our homes and our cultures are at risk. So here Van Neerven articulates the need for stories that show the impact of climate change on humans and their fellow creatures. And Em said a few weeks back that Deborah Jordan gave you an introduction to AustNet and the dataset on climate fiction, so that's very helpful. So I think you'll have some idea of the text that I'm talking about. What I'm going to do is delve into a couple of the books. So Clade, George Turner's The Sea and Summer, and then Ellen van Neerven's story, Water, from her collection. And I'm going to talk about structure and a couple of the themes in those books. And then talk a little bit about First Nations fiction about climate change, because that's mode of storytelling in particular blurs the boundaries between fiction and reality, which is what a lot of climate fiction is doing. So just to keep you busy while I'm talking about climate fiction, here's a picture of a esteemed Prime Minister who's causing a lot of these problems. But when writers talk about climate change using the form of the novel, they're going to run into some problems. And some of you may know The Great Derangement, published by the Indian writer Amitav Ghosh in 2016. And in that, he argued that the realist novel is unable to accommodate climate change because the novel is a product of capitalism and it regulates and orders our experience in ways that disguise the unpredictable world that we live in. Now, James Bradley is the author of Clade and the more recent Ghost Species, and he's one of the people in Australia who's done quite a bit of thinking about writing about climate fiction. And he comments on the limitations of the social realist novel for addressing concerns of climate change. And he says novels and stories which emphasise the violent and exceptional effects of climate change, so that's floods, fires and storms, are likely to seem awkward, vulgar and sensational because they violate the ways in which realist fiction circumscribes reality, diverting our attention from a world that exists outside of social relations. So whether or not you agree with that, we could talk about that in the discussion or any other questions that you have in the presentation that I'm doing. But his contention is that the problem with the novel, which was designed for bourgeois readership, is that it imposes order on what's an open-ended and diffuse problem. And Ursula Hase echoes that in her book Sense of Place and Sense of Planet, that was published back in 2008. And she writes that, quote, climate change poses a challenge for narrative and lyrical forms that have conventionally focused on individuals, families, or nations, since it requires the articulation of connections between events at vastly different scales. End of quote. So there's a problem going on with the structure of the novel. And I think what climate change is doing is breaking that structure. And another problem with the realist novel is the representation of time. So climate change is happening so slowly that it's difficult to capture it in a way that captivates readers. So it's not yet apocalyptic in its consequences. So I think it's getting there, definitely. We've seen that with the floods and the droughts. And English nature writer Robert Macfarlane argues that an apocalypse comes, quote, spoofy, automatically, and as such offers great opportunities for the literary imagination. By contrast, climate change occurs discreetly and incrementally, and as such, it presents the literary imagination with a series of difficulties: how to dramatize aggregating detail and how to plot slow change. The traditional form of the novel, which is that arc of rising tension, a confrontation, and then the relaxation of conflict, doesn't work very well with climate fiction. So I don't think that stopped authors from trying to use the realist novel. So you may have read Barbara Kingsolver's Flight Behaviour. That was published back in 2012. And that follows a crop of monarch butterflies, and the butterflies are climate refugees. So they've abandoned their flight path from Canada to their usual winter habitat, to a sunny hillside in Mexico. And they've been overwintering there in Mexico for generations. But because of logging and landslides, they divert their course and they end up in Tennessee, and it won't stop raining. But if the temperatures drop too low, those butterflies are going to be wiped out. So she uses the character of an ordinary suburban housewife to talk about the change that's happening and to explain it to the reader. So she uses realism. So other examples are the Australian novel Anchor Point by Alice Robinson, and that's set during a time of protracted drought, and it ends with the inferno bushfires and a sense of impending doom. Another one is Muriel Juchot's The World Without Us, and that's about bees and families. And Juchot uses the stresses on families to mirror the stress placed upon bees. So there's a relationship between non-human and human, which I'll talk about a bit later. I think there's a new term for these novels. I think they're called first impact fiction. And that's according to a US author, Ashley Shelby, who wrote South Pole Station, because they're about the impact of things that are happening now, such as the ice sheets breaking up and the massive die-offs of bees and insects. So there's been a couple of surveys of climate fiction by Adeline Johns-Putra. I think she's British, I can't remember. So she did one survey in 2011 and another one 5 years later, 2016. So I'm surely due for another one soon, because the genre has just exploded in the last few years. And in her follow-up research, so that's in 2016, she noticed that a majority of the novels appear as part of a futuristic, dystopian and or post-apocalyptic setting. And I'm not sure if that's to do with the size of the genres, because there's more writers writing genre fiction than literary fiction, and so the market's bigger for those books, or if it's because dystopia's speculative fiction, apocalyptic fiction is more elastic than literary fiction. But whatever the reason, I think it's safe to argue that climate fiction is rooted in the speculative, hence that term Cli-Fi, the pun on sci-fi. And you may know Dan Bloom first coined this term. He calls himself a self-described public relations activist, and he goes around harassing everyone who uses the term, whether correctly or incorrectly. He's pulled back a bit now. I think someone told him off, but it's his life work to promote the term Cli-Fi. But James Bradley doesn't agree with that term climate fiction because he argues that there's nothing new about books that are about worlds transfigured by environmental disaster or environmental change. So he cites John Wyndham's The Day of the Triffids, John Christopher's Grass, John Brummer's The Sheep Look Up. And he says that these novels tend to elide traditional genre categories. So he's saying the blurring between fiction, speculative fiction, has been happening forever. So there doesn't seem to be a point in imposing another category on them. And he also argues that these books are a subset of a larger phenomenon of vulnerability, grief, and loss associated with climate change. And you can see that in novels such as Emily St. John Mandel's Station 11. It's a fantastic book about what happens to the world when it's decimated by a virus. So it's prescient, but really, really beautiful. So he says we don't need a new term, but I think there are definite patterns appearing in climate fiction. And I think there's an argument to be made for keeping it as a genre. So those patterns include the structure. So I mentioned that the traditional form of the novel is breaking, and I think a lot of writers are using a mosaic structure, which I'll talk about in a second, to represent climate fiction. And there's also definite themes, such as the theme of inheritance and kind of what happens to parents and their kids across generations. And I think there's also something going on with class. And there's also the First Nations climate fiction, which I'll talk about at the end. So I'm going to talk to you a bit now about structure. Hang on a sec. And as I mentioned, one of the issues with trying to describe climate change is scale. So you might know of Timothy Morton's idea of the hyperobject, which is an object so massively distributed in time and space that it transcends specificity. So and climate change is a hyperobject. So trying to get a handle on it can be difficult. And one approach that writers use is to structure the novel as a mosaic novel, or alternatively a short story cycle or a composite novel. And Maggie Dunn and Anne Norris, there's some scholars, and they describe the short story cycle as, quote, a literary work composed of shorter texts that, though individually complete and autonomous, are interrelated in a coherent whole according to one or more organising principles, end of quote. That's from their book, The Composite Novel. It was published in 1995. So you can see why that might be a useful form for depicting climate change. It's a vehicle for exploring localised effects while showing that they're still part of a networked whole. And some examples of Australian novels that use this form are Stephen Amsterdam's Things We Didn't See Coming and Sue Isles' Nightsiders. And these works are well suited to handling subjects such as a sense of isolation, fragmentation, or indeterminacy, which is what's happening to all of us with climate change. Things are being broken up and we feel like we're losing our connections. But it's also good at showing how characters are experiencing a sense of a search for a community, because it's a whole lot of little stories that are all tied up into a whole. So if you've read Clade, which is the story of a family and generations of kids, Summer, the daughter of the protagonist, leaves her family, goes to the other side of the world. She's estranged from them. And her father goes to look for her, and he finds her 10 years later in England. And he's observing her, and he says, quote, she is so alone and so lost, and it frightens him, not because of what she might do to others, but what she might do to herself, end of quote. So there's that feeling of isolation and alienation, and her father trying to connect with her across a vast distance. And I think Adam, that's the protagonist's name, it's not very original, Adam's fears for his daughter signal how important it is for us to remain connected in a changing world and a changing climate. And that's not just in terms of our connection to other human beings, it's in terms of our connection to the non-human world. The mosaic novel doesn't just happen in terms of like creating short stories, it also happens with points of view. So in The Sea in Summer, which I'll talk about a little bit, the author George Turner uses a number of third person, like it's got a number of characters, and he narrates them using the third person perspective. And so you have a number of characters in this community discussing what's going on, and then you kind of stitch them together in your head, and you work out what that community is like. So that's my little spiel about what I think about structure and climate change in Australian novels. And I just want to talk a little bit about themes, particularly that theme of inheritance that I mentioned, and the other one of class. So going back to Clade, it opens with a climate scientist working in the Antarctic, and he's waiting to hear from his wife if she's pregnant or not, because they're trying IVF. And Adeline Johns-Butcher, who I mentioned, that this idea of appealing to posterity or inheritance in novels about climate fiction is quite problematic, because it reinforces assumptions about heteronormativity, and there's this pressure on women to conceive and love a child, but the world's falling apart, so why would you want to have a child? And Bradley's talking about that idea of conception and inheritance through the character Ellie, who is the wife of Adam. And Ellie is talking about her son, and she says, quote, "I once read something by a woman who said that the one thing no mother would say was that she wishes she hadn't had children, and that she would have been better off without them," end of quote. And Summer, Adam and Ellie's child, wishes all the time that she hadn't conceived and had a baby. That's a little bit worrying, because her child has autism. So I was not sure what Bradley's saying there. But he is complicating this idea of having kids, which aligns with what Adeline Johns-Butcher is saying. And so Johns-Butcher is arguing that the climate change novel opens up a space for these discussions and these concerns. And the novel, or the genre, allows readers, quote, to think as well as feel their way around the notion of responsibility to the future and its attendant anxieties, end of quote. So it's a vehicle that helps us to feel what things might be like in the future, as well as thinking about them. The other thing that's happening in Clade is that one of the kids gets sick and dies. And that's a very complicated relationship. So Ellie is married to Adam, and Ellie's father is Tom, and Tom has a child with his second wife called Declan, and Declan dies. And when the child dies, I think that's a premonition of the calamity that's coming. And what Bradley does when he's talking about Declan is he focalizes the chapter through Maddie. So he uses her perspective, and that helps him put the reader in Maddie's shoes, and they feel the loss of the child as if it's their own child. And I think that's what novels are good at doing. They're helping you feel things that you might not otherwise be able to conceptualize. But what he's doing, he's not just talking about the loss of a human child, he's talking about the loss of other creatures. So in this section where he's talking about the loss of the child, he finishes with Tom, the father's, observation on how the birds have stopped breeding and their eggs aren't hatching and the chickens are dying from the heat. So I think this is echoing Adam and Ellie's attempt to conceive, and also the loss of this child, Declan. And what he's doing is showing how this loss is experienced not just by humans, but also by the non-human world. And I think also when we as readers feel this loss, or at least when some of us do, because not everyone is, receptive to the idea of loss and extinction, it's something we can't quite define. And later on in the novel, Noah is Adam's autistic grandson, and he has a carer called Lijuan, and Lijuan's aunt dies, and Lijuan says, quote, "I don't know how I feel about it because I didn't really know her, but it still feels weird, like I've lost something that I can't describe. And I think that is a way of talking about the loss that we're feeling when species die. We don't know them, but we know that something's missing, and it's just too amorphous to describe it. So Bradley's saying, well, we're not just related to other human beings, we're related to other animals, and we're feeling their loss, even though we can't articulate it. And the other thing he shows is how the loss of a child can also destabilize a family and that family's cohesiveness. And Real Zhuzhou also explores that in The World Without Us. And she's talking about how a breakdown can have a ripple effect. So Maddie and Tom lose their child. Sorry, this is in play. Maddie and Tom lose their child. They grow apart. And similar thing is happening in The World Without Us. And Zhuzhou uses the metaphor of bees, which is also kind of what Bradley's doing as well. So he's showing how the loss of families has repercussions beyond us, beyond the nuclear human family. And that theme of inheritance is tied to the structure of the book, because it's talking about generations of people and of a family. And I think what's interesting in this book, I don't think it's a particularly brilliant piece of work, but I think what it's doing is quite interesting in terms of the structure and the characters. And when I gave a lecture on Clade a couple of years back, and I asked the students, what did you think? And one of them said that the characters were quite shallow, and that's true. He doesn't spend a lot of time doing character development. And then this very sharp person put up their hand and said, it feels like the characters don't have any substance against the kind of the climactic events that are happening in the book. They're kind of bowled over by the weight of climate change, although it was very astute. And so it's made me wonder if when you structure the books in this way, you're sacrificing something, which is character development. And so I think it's interesting to compare this book to George Turner's The Sea in Summer, which I'm going to talk about now. What's my next slide? Hang on a sec. Yeah. So this is a book. George Turner's The Sea in Summer was published in 1987, and it was the first book of Australian climate fiction. And it's about class, which I find very interesting because not many people are writing about class in Australia these days. And this book was from the 80s. And it mimics, it has a lot of realist elements in it as well as speculative, and it has a lot of really good character development in it. And what it shows is that the poor are going to suffer, or are already suffering, with climate change. And so the rich people, like their houses might fall into the sea, but they can usually buy their way out of a problem. But the poor people are going to have to grapple with it in very real ways. And this is one of the benefits of this book, of The Sea in Summer. You can see how poor people have to deal with climate change. And it's mirroring what Rob Dixon talks about in Slow Violence and the environmentalism of the poor. You might already know this one, but I'll just read out the quote because I think it's pertinent to The Sea in Summer. So Dixon writes that slow violence is a violence that occurs gradually and out of sight, a violence of delayed destruction that is dispersed across time and space, and attritional violence that is typically not viewed as violence at all. Violence is customarily conceived as an event or action that is immediate in time, it's explosive and spectacular in space, and is erupting into instant sensational visibility. We need, I believe, to engage a different kind of violence, a violence that is neither spectacular nor instantaneous, but rather incremental and accretive, its calamitous repercussions playing out across a range of temporal scales, and in doing so, we also need to engage the representational, narrative and strategic challenges posed by the relative invisibility of slow violence. And I think The Sea in Summer is doing this far more effectively than Clade, because I think Clade is quite a glossy book. It's almost superficial in times, at least in comparison to The Sea in Summer, which is it has a gritty realism about it. So it's set in 21st century, amid global warming, set in a city. They've got rising sea levels and temperatures, economic collapse, and they have a welfare state. It's divided between the middle class. They have jobs, they're called the sweet, and the unemployed, and they're called the swill. And it follows two brothers, Teddy and Francis Conway, who they grew up sweet, and then their father lost his job and killed himself. And so they fall into the fringe, which is kind of between these two groups, the genteel poor. And they both react differently to their situation. One passes exams, he becomes part of the social elite in police intelligence, and the other one is amazing with maths, and he does black market accounting jobs to get by. And then the thrust of the novel is about trying to survive as the waters rise, but also someone's engineering a virus to sterilize the swill to get rid of them. And so it's showing the warming and the flooding of the world, but it doesn't have the boom and crash of an apocalypse. It's an urban setting, so it's got these sea rises and occasional flooding. And there's another climate fiction scholar called Adam Trexler, and he writes that the flood has been the dominant literary strategy for locating climate change across the last 40 years. And that's largely because of historical precedents, predecessors. So you've got the flood in Noah's Ark. And it's also because, while not many people are aware of methane or mass extinction, they do know about floods. And Trexler also points out that 60% of the world's largest cities are near the coast, and that's true of Australia, because the cities are located by the sea and the rivers, because we needed shipping when white people settled or invaded. I've read somewhere that Brisbane will become the Venice of the North with the rising sea levels. So you might all want to move to Tasmania. Not good with the water. So there's this tension that I've been talking about between realism and speculative fiction. And when Bradley's saying, social realism doesn't work, I think his main contention is the novel doesn't, the formal structure of the novel can't contain what is an open-ended problem. But when you read The Sea in Summer, you understand the importance of realism when talking about climate fiction, because we can see what it's like, we can imagine what it's like for people in that environment. And even that word swill, which is food waste mixed with water, which you give to pigs, and you see how that plays out in the novel with the waters rising and taking the waste with it, like human waste, but also what other people perceive to be human waste, which is human beings who don't have money. So it's really, really interesting book. And so you see the slow violence happening because Alison is the boy's mother, and she's constantly replanting and repairing her garden. So she's trying to keep things alive, and those things keep getting demolished. And then there's whole families crammed into small spaces, and then girls have to prostitute themselves for food. And that ties in with another one of Nixon's arguments, and he says that poor will lack the resources to defend themselves against the violence that's practiced upon them. Just in the interest of time, I'm going to rush on now and talk about First Nations climate fiction. Oh, they're my pictures, sorry. So that's the various editions of The Sea in Summer, and it was published in the US as The Drowning Towers. So I urge everyone to read it if you haven't. So just circling back to First Nations fiction, and this essay by Van Neerven, she writes that when a child's learning is the land, disappearing land means knowledge can no longer be passed down. A child loses its education, the equivalent of libraries, textbooks turning to dust. Maori writer Melissa Lukashenko speaks often about how important identity is to the mental, physical and emotional health of all Indigenous Australians, but especially the young. With interconnected relationships to land, identity is island, river, mangroves, forest and desert. Identity is magpie geese, emu and spinifex. So Van Neerven goes on to explain that the magpie goose is important to Aboriginal people in the top end, so the Murrumbidgee people. They hunt it for food and they pass on skills and knowledge to the next generation. They fulfill their kinship obligations, this bird. But there's more cyclones coming because of climate change, and that threatens the magpie geese's livelihoods. and 20% of the bird population in Northern Australia are at risk of decline, in the next few decades, and the magpie geese are one of those birds. So Van Neerven asks, they have already lost their southern habitats, will they lose another? And how will First Nations people cope with the loss of totemic species so integral to their lives? There's already a large body of literature by First Nations writing that talks about how First Nations community have lived and are living through the loss of land and resources, community and kin since colonisation. So Van Neerven